All right, Kieran, tip number 4, please.
So, I don't know if this has got consensus, but some behaviours are more important than others.
I like this because, again, you know I love a clickbait headline. This is a good one. This is bringing in the numbers that we need, Kieran. Right, tell us about this.
So, I don't think hierarchy is a perfect metaphor, but I think it's a workable metaphor, and that gives us the space to think about how we teach. So you've had lots of people talking about behaviour, and so, for instance, in any hierarchy, behaviour would be the first thing that you need to get right in your classroom before you can do anything else. Can make everything else possible, because the routines we have, the expectations of learning, then allow you to focus on your pedagogy. So, at the start of Thinking Deeply about Primary Mathematics, I said, read Tom Bennett's work before you even start this book, because it's going to save you. I learned that the hard way, and I think probably most teachers do, don't they? And then I would have explanation and instruction, because I think if you get good at those and you can explain things, then you build some space from your senior leadership team, because when they're popping around the class, they'll see, there's what they would call good teaching going on, and we know it's only part of the picture, but I think if we can establish that with some modelling, perhaps as a bare minimum, then you could teach kids, and I think they could make progress. And once you've got those in place, then you start thinking about things like variation, like task design, and maybe strategy selection. Because that's the nuts and bolts of the thinking we need to do in our PPA time. So we're planning, we're thinking about the question selection, we're thinking about, well, do I want to have a background of sort of a variant background, or is it invariance? I don't think you can think about that if you haven't cracked the fundamentals. And so I would almost have, there are many, many more things that go into what it means to be a teacher, but I would say that general hierarchy gives you the most rapid and sustained progress, because it gives you space, but it also establishes a minimum competency very, very, very early on.
Got it. Just give us a hierarchy one more time, Kieran.
So behaviour, explanation, instruction and modelling, and then your things like variation, task design, strategy selection. But in that group, I'm having everything that we, like if we're reading about education and we're thinking about confidence-weighted multiple choice questions, they're not the first thing you explore, but they're definitely very powerful once you've got the hang of the basic role.
Right, this is brilliant. So the first thing to say is, obviously, when I first started teaching, I did the exact opposite. So all my thoughts was on the tasks, and I wasn't even good at that. It was just like poor task selection, and that's all I was focusing on. I'm really I completely agree with you. I'm going to ask you the worst question in the world, Kieran, and I know the answer is going to be depends. But how long does it take to kind of move, I guess, down the hierarchy? Like how long will it typically take to get your behaviour to the point where then you can start thinking about your explanations and modelling?
I mean, you would hope that within the first 6 weeks, you're right, it does depend, and teachers will take it to it more naturally. But I think where a school has really good systems in place, and it's just a matter of adopting those systems, that's much more manageable than having to establish them against the tide. But I would hope that by October, November, we can start thinking about pedagogy, because the class we're learning as as default.
So this is the obvious follow-up question, and I apologise, it sounds really kind of aggressive, this one, I don't mean it to. What's happening in those 6 weeks in terms of learning then, if the kind of focus of the teacher is on behaviour? Is it just a case of, the explanations and task design will be suboptimal, but that's just the way it's got to be?
I mean, my preference is for the utilisation of high-quality textbooks, so you're almost guaranteeing a minimum standard of instruction, even if you just follow the script. I'm not saying that's the best way to use high quality textbooks, but it's on a fundamental level possible. Where that's absent, having really high quality curricula, things like the REACH curricula in history and geography and science, they go a long way to supporting teachers in their delivery. And then the more competent and confident you become, then you can experiment with those really interesting bits of pedagogy. I accept that those aren't in place in all schools, particularly not in primary schools, but that's what I would recommend. And I think even if those aren't in place, if the behaviour isn't sorted, the learning is going to be suboptimal anyway. So I don't necessarily think there's a comparison to be made.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense. I've spoken about this perhaps on the Missed About Maths podcast, that if you'd have asked me, any time in the first 12 years of my career, is it a good idea to have kind of centrally planned lessons or, prescribed approaches, I would have said definitely not. Like, the whole point of being a teacher, you want to be creative, freedom, express yourself and all that. But I look back now and think I was talking nonsense, because, as you say, if you're starting out teaching, and even if you're an experienced teacher in a new school, if you don't have that behaviour right, it's going to be an absolute disaster. And it's such a weight off your mind if somebody says, look, just use this example. We've thought this through. This is probably a good example to use. And I'll tell you what, once you've explained it, give them this task, because this is probably a good task to use. And as you say, that'll get them through, won't it? Most of those kind of 6 weeks or so, and then you can then start to look at the next bit, as opposed to either looking at things the wrong way around or trying to just sort everything out all at once. It just doesn't work. So the more I think about it, prescription, particularly early on, it's probably a good thing, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I tell people this all the time, but I had her when I started teaching, and within 18 months it was gone. And I think it was the inspection criteria, because it was 6 activities for every single lesson, throughout the day. So, there's only so long your follicles can put up with it.
That's good. Hey, let me ask you just this thing now, Kieran, just in case I forget to ask you this. So, obviously, we've done 4 tips here, and this one in particular just highlights how much thought needs to go into being a maths teacher. You've got to get behaviour right, then you've got to think about explanations, modelling, and then you start thinking about all the nuances, task design, variation. But the thing is, primary teachers, they've got to do this for all subjects. How the hell do there is not enough money in the world to pay me to be a primary teacher. How do they do it, Kieran? Something's got to give, hasn't it?
I think where schools have really sensible approaches to workload, you can prioritise thinking and learning. I've got a colleague, Lloyd Williams-Jones, been on the podcast quite a lot. He will give his teachers whole days at the start of term to brush up on their subject knowledge. And I think where that kind of situation exists and people are allowed to explore, say they're teaching the Vikings and Scandinavian history in that sort of 1st century, wouldn't it? Then spending 6 hours getting to grips with it, I think goes a long way. And I think when I think about school development, I'm thinking about, well, in 5 years' time, if we have a body of teachers who are sufficiently knowledgeable about, both the subject knowledge and the pedagogical content knowledge of a broader range of subjects, then I think we're moving in the right direction. I do think that too much is asked. I think the curriculum is too broad. My preference would be for a specialist model, but I do know that that's, again, not a consensus view. Schools have just got to do the best they can to provide their teachers with time to think. So if they're not doing unnecessary paperwork, then you can spend time thinking. And if you're not doing other bureaucratic chores, staff meetings that could have been emails, then you have more time in your day. So it's about how you use, the ideal being 45 hours in a week. How do you use those 45 hours? Well, I'm going to use a substantial amount teaching, but the rest I want to focus on what's important rather than things that are there because they've always been there.
Two quick follow-ups on this. I'm fascinated by primary schools, Kieran. How is maths the subject that gets the biggest focus in terms of kind of CPD, pedagogy, and so on? I'd imagine English should be at a similar level. But what about the other subjects? Is there enough time to think deeply about geography and art and all that kind of stuff?
I think at the minute the expectation is that there is. Schools would maybe have on an inset day we'll do some focus on art. But the new inspection framework has sort of almost guided schools towards a model where they do have to spend more time thinking about sort of subjects that would have been neglected before 2018. Because I remember when I first started teaching, it really was reading, writing and mathematics that we had to get right, because that was what the school would be judged on essentially. and the rest, well, it was okay. You know, I mean, I was lucky that I had a teacher who valued lots of those subjects, and so provided us with additional opportunities. But I think it's becoming the norm. I don't think we've got it right at primary in terms of how we use our staff meeting time, and there are definitely people like Matt Swain who are talking about how we might use it in a different way, and you know, maybe breaking one long meeting into 2 smaller meetings and having a focus over 5 or 6 weeks rather than a different focus every week. But yeah, I think the jury's still out on that one, and we'll see where we are in maybe 4 or 5 years' time once we've been through a full cycle.
Last question on this, Kieran. I'm always fascinated by how much of maths pedagogy transfers to other subjects. So anytime a school asks me to come in and do a whole kind of staff training session, I always say, look, I don't have a clue what I'm doing outside of my nice little secondary maths bubble. But then I know some of my books are read by teachers outside of maths, and they can find the strategies apply and so on. How do you find that at primary? So let's take, for example, you were saying about worked examples. Would that transfer across? Would teachers be able to use what they do, worked examples in maths, in history, in English and so on? Or are there aspects of maths that transfer quite nicely across?
I think so. I think particularly those that have been researched by cognitive psychologists. And it might be easier for maths teachers or teaching maths because a lot of the examples are quite often mathematics based. But, you know, for instance, something like retrieval practice will work equally effectively across the curriculum. And I think, you know, one of the things that we've tried as a country in mathematics is to establish the idea that all pupils can attain well if they're given the right support. And so we use manipulatives quite often. We used multiple examples. We use sort of scaffolds. But there's no reason why we can't do that in history, you know, and scaffold and really, you know, thinking carefully about the information we present to pupils, and so then that will almost alleviate some of the cognitive burden on those pupils. So I think it does take a lot more thought, and perhaps because the broader conversation has fewer examples from the other subjects. But if you look at the principles, you know, like I was Michael talking about general behaviours, you look at those general principles and think, how might this look? Well, there's nothing to lose from trying those out, I don't think.
Fantastic.